Chicago, 1962. The city was experiencing a period of economic growth and social change. Amidst the bustling streets and towering skyscrapers, two young individuals were about to embark on a journey that would lead to an unforeseen tragedy. Sarah Thompson, a 24-year-old secretary at a prominent law firm, had moved to Chicago from her small hometown in Indiana 2 years prior. She was ambitious, intelligent, and determined to make a name for herself in the big city. Her blonde hair and blue eyes, combined with her quick wit, often turned heads at the office. James Harrison, 28, was a rising star in the world of advertising. Handsome and charismatic, he had a way with words that served him well both in his professional and personal life. His dark hair and piercing green eyes gave him a mysterious allure that many found irresistible. Their paths crossed at a charity gala organized by Sarah's law firm in the spring of 1962. James was there representing his ad agency, which was handling the event's publicity. As Sarah was helping to check in guests, James approached the registration table. Their eyes met, and there was an immediate spark of attraction. Throughout the evening, James found excuses to engage Sarah in conversation. He was captivated by her intelligence and charm, while she was drawn to his confidence and wit. By the end of the night, James had secured Sarah's phone number, promising to call her for a proper date. Their courtship was a whirlwind of romantic dinners, dancing at jazz clubs, and long walks along Lake Michigan. James showered Sarah with attention and gifts, making her feel like the most special woman in the world. Sarah, who had always been cautious in relationships, found herself falling deeply in love. Within 6 months, James proposed. He presented Sarah with a stunning diamond ring during a romantic dinner cruise on the Chicago River. Overwhelmed with joy, Sarah accepted without hesitation. She believed she had found her soulmate, the man with whom she would build a life and grow old. As they began planning their wedding, Sarah threw herself into the preparations with enthusiasm. She envisioned a grand ceremony at St. Michael's Church, followed by a reception at the elegant Palmer House Hotel. James seemed supportive, agreeing to most of her ideas and offering to handle some of the arrangements himself. What Sarah didn't know was that James harbored a dark secret. His life in Chicago was built on a foundation of lies. James Harrison wasn't even his real name. Born Robert Caldwell in St. Louis, Missouri, he had left behind a wife and 2 young children 3 years ago. A compulsive liar and master manipulator, Robert had created the persona of James Harrison to escape his past and start anew in Chicago. Robert's first marriage had been one of convenience, a hasty union after his high school sweetheart became pregnant. He quickly felt trapped in the role of husband and father, yearning for the excitement and freedom of his bachelor days. Rather than face his responsibilities, he chose to run away, abandoning his family without a word. In Chicago, Robert reinvented himself as James Harrison. He used his natural charm and gift for storytelling to secure a position at the advertising agency, quickly rising through the ranks. He created an elaborate backstory, complete with tales of an Ivy League education and world travels. No one questioned his past, as his work spoke for itself. When he met Sarah, Robert saw an opportunity to solidify his new identity. She was beautiful, accomplished, and came from a good family. Marriage to Sarah would provide him with respectability and connections that could further his career. While he was attracted to her, his primary motivation was self-interest rather than love. As the wedding preparations progressed, Robert became increasingly nervous. He knew that a formal ceremony would require documentation that he couldn't provide without risking exposure. He began to make excuses to delay setting a firm date, claiming work commitments and family issues that needed to be resolved first. Sarah, deeply in love and trusting, didn't suspect anything amiss. She attributed James' occasional distant behavior to stress from work and wedding planning. She focused on creating the perfect day, unaware that her dream was about to shatter in the most horrific way imaginable. Little did either of them know that their story would soon take a dark turn, culminating in a shocking act of violence that would send ripples through Chicago society and leave an indelible mark on the city's criminal history. As the summer of 1963 approached, Sarah's excitement about her upcoming nuptials grew. She had already chosen her wedding dress, a stunning white gown with intricate lace detailing, and had asked her younger sister Emily to be her maid of honor. The bridesmaids' dresses were ordered, the venue was booked, and the invitations were ready to be sent out. All that remained was to set a firm date. However, James Robert continued to be evasive about finalizing the wedding date. His excuses became more elaborate and frequent. He claimed his parents were having health issues and might not be able to travel. He mentioned a big account at work that required his full attention. Each time Sarah brought up the subject, he skillfully deflected, leaving her feeling confused and slightly hurt. One afternoon in late May, Sarah decided to surprise James at his office. She had just picked up the sample wedding invitations and wanted to show them to him. As she approached the reception desk at the advertising agency, she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. "Did you hear about James?" one receptionist whispered to another. "Apparently he's not who he says he is. Mary in HR was doing some background checks and his social security number doesn't match his name. She thinks he might be using a false identity." Sarah froze, her mind reeling from this information. She quietly slipped away before anyone noticed her presence, the wedding invitations clutched tightly in her trembling hands. Once outside, she leaned against the building, trying to make sense of what she had just heard. Could it be true? Was the man she loved living a lie? Determined to uncover the truth, Sarah began her own investigation. She started by searching for James's parents, whom she had never met. He had always claimed they lived in California and were too frail to travel. Using the phone book and some careful questioning of mutual friends, Sarah discovered that no one had ever actually seen or spoken to James's parents. Next, she focused on his educational background. James had boasted about his degree from Yale University. But when Sarah contacted the alumni office, they had no record of a James Harrison graduating in the year he claimed. This discrepancy sent a chill down her spine. Sarah's world was crumbling around her. The man she thought she knew, the future she had planned, it was all based on lies. But she needed concrete proof before confronting James. She decided to hire a private investigator, using money she had saved for her honeymoon. The investigator worked quickly and efficiently. Within a week, he presented Sarah with a file that confirmed her worst fears and revealed even more shocking truths. James Harrison was indeed a false identity. His real name was Robert Caldwell, and he was already married with 2 children in St. Louis. The file contained copies of Robert's marriage certificate, his children's birth certificates, and recent photographs of his family. There was also a police report filed by his wife 3 years ago, reporting him as a missing person. The investigator had even managed to obtain a recent photo of Robert's wife and children standing in front of their modest St. Louis home, looking tired and dejected. Sarah's initial shock gave way to a deep, burning anger. She felt used, manipulated, and utterly betrayed. The future she had envisioned, a loving marriage, children, a life built on trust and mutual respect, had been nothing but an illusion. As she stared at the photographs of Robert's unsuspecting family, Sarah's anger began to crystallize into something darker. She thought about the months of lies, the elaborate deceptions, the future that had been stolen from her. A plan began to form in her mind, a plan that would ensure Robert could never deceive another woman again. Sarah knew that confronting Robert directly would be futile. He was a skilled liar and manipulator. He would only spin more tales and try to charm his way out of the situation. No, she needed to catch him off guard, to strike when he least expected it. The pre-wedding photo shoot was scheduled for the following week. It was meant to be a joyous occasion, capturing the happy couple in various romantic settings around Chicago. Sarah decided this would be the perfect opportunity to execute her plan. She would play along, pretending everything was normal, and then, when the moment was right, she would exact her revenge. Over the next few days, Sarah meticulously prepared. She visited a specialty shop in a seedy part of town, purchasing a small, sharp knife that could be easily concealed. She practiced hiding it in her clothing, ensuring she could access it quickly and discreetly. As the day of the photo shoot approached, Sarah's demeanor changed. The bubbly, excited bride-to-be was replaced by a calm, focused woman with a steely glint in her eye. She had one goal now: to make Robert pay for his deception, to ensure he could never hurt another woman or abandon another family. The stage was set for a tragedy that would shock Chicago's society and leave an indelible mark on the city's criminal history. What was meant to be a celebration of love would instead become a scene of violence and retribution, forever changing the lives of all involved. As the day of the pre-wedding photo shoot drew nearer, Sarah's mind became consumed with the details of her plan. She was no longer the carefree bride-to-be, Instead, she had transformed into a focused, calculating woman bent on revenge. The betrayal she felt had hardened her heart, pushing her towards a course of action she never would have considered before. Sarah's first step was to carefully select the location for the photo shoot. She suggested to James Robert that they should capture their love story across various iconic Chicago locations. Her true motive, however, was to find a place that would provide both the opportunity for her act and a quick escape route. After considerable research, Sarah decided on Lincoln Park as the primary location. The sprawling urban park offered a mix of picturesque scenery and secluded spots. She particularly noted the area near the zoo, which had several winding paths and dense vegetation that could provide cover. To ensure privacy, Sarah insisted on hiring a small, independent photographer rather than a large studio. She found Thomas Green, a young freelance photographer trying to build his portfolio. Thomas was eager for the job and agreed to Sarah's specific requests about locations and timing without question. Sarah meticulously planned the sequence of the shoot. She arranged for the final photos to be taken near the park's south pond, a relatively secluded area, especially in the late afternoon when she scheduled the shoot. She calculated that the fading light would work to her advantage, making it harder for the photographer to capture clear images and providing better cover for her actions. In the days leading up to the photo shoot, Sarah maintained a facade of excitement and love whenever she was around James. She laughed at his jokes, discussed wedding plans, and even initiated intimate moments. All the while she was studying him closely, looking for vulnerabilities, noting his habits and reactions. Sarah also took care to establish an alibi for herself. She confided in her sister Emily about James' true identity and his existing family, expressing her heartbreak and anger. She told Emily that she planned to confront James during the photo shoot and end the engagement. This conversation served dual purposes. It provided a potential explanation for any emotional outburst during the shoot, and it gave Sarah a sympathetic ear who could later testify to her state of mind. The weapon was a crucial part of Sarah's plan. The small, sharp knife she had purchased was perfect for concealment, but she needed to ensure she could access it quickly and discreetly. She spent hours practicing retrieving the knife from various hiding spots in her clothing, finally deciding to strap it to her inner thigh, hidden beneath her flowing skirt. Sarah also considered the aftermath of her planned action. She packed a change of clothes in her car, parked strategically near the park's exit. She withdrew a significant amount of cash from her savings account, enough to allow her to disappear for a while if necessary. She even went as far as to research bus schedules to neighboring states, planning potential escape routes. As part of her preparation, Sarah started keeping a detailed diary. In it, she poured out her feelings of betrayal and anger, documenting James's lies and manipulations. She included copies of the evidence the private investigator had gathered. This diary, she reasoned, could serve as an explanation for her actions if she were caught, possibly garnering sympathy from authorities or a future jury. The night before the photo shoot, Sarah barely slept. She lay awake, rehearsing every detail of her plan in her mind. She visualized each step, from the moment they would arrive at the park to her final act of revenge. In her mind, she had justified her actions completely. She wasn't just avenging herself, she reasoned, but protecting countless other women from falling victim to Robert's deceit. As dawn broke on the day of the photo shoot, Sarah rose with a sense of grim determination. She dressed carefully, choosing a flowing sundress that would conceal the knife while allowing easy access. She applied her makeup meticulously, ensuring she looked every bit the radiant bride-to-be. Before leaving her apartment, Sarah took one last look at the evidence file. Her eyes lingered on the photo of Robert's wife and children in St. Louis. For a moment, she felt a pang of doubt. Was she really prepared to take a life? To potentially orphan 2 children? But then she remembered her own shattered dreams, the future that had been stolen from her, and her resolve hardened once more. Sarah tucked the knife into its hiding place and left her apartment. As she drove to meet James for their fateful photo shoot, her mind was clear and focused. In just a few hours, she told herself, it would all be over. Robert Caldwell, alias James Harrison, would pay for his deception, and she would ensure he could never hurt another woman again. Little did Sarah know that her carefully laid plans were about to collide with the unpredictable nature of reality, setting in motion a chain of events that would alter the course of multiple lives and send shockwaves through Chicago society. June 15, 1963, dawned bright and clear in Chicago. The weather was perfect for an outdoor photo shoot, warm with a gentle breeze, the kind of day that seemed to promise new beginnings. For Sarah Thompson, however, this day marked an ending. Sarah arrived at Lincoln Park at 3:30 p.m., 30 minutes before the scheduled start of the photo shoot. She took a moment to compose herself in her car, checking her appearance one last time in the rearview mirror. The woman who stared back at her was almost unrecognizable. Behind the carefully applied makeup and styled hair, her eyes held a cold determination that would have shocked those who knew her. At precisely 3:45 p.m., James Robert pulled into the parking lot. Sarah watched him emerge from his car, looking handsome and carefree in a light summer suit. For a moment, her resolve wavered. This was the man she had loved, the man she had planned to spend her life with. But then she remembered the photographs of his real family in St. Louis, and her determination returned, stronger than ever. The photographer, Thomas Green, arrived at 3:55 p.m., laden with equipment. He was young and enthusiastic, chatting animatedly about his vision for the shoot as they walked towards the first location. Sarah nodded and smiled, playing the role of the excited bride-to-be, while James charmed Thomas with easy conversation. The first hour of the photo shoot went smoothly. They captured images by the park's famous fountain, on the bridge over the South Pond, and among the colorful flower gardens. Sarah performed flawlessly, smiling and posing as if she didn't have a care in the world. James, ever the natural in front of a camera, was in his element. As the afternoon wore on, they moved towards the more secluded areas of the park, just as Sarah had planned. The fading light created a romantic atmosphere, but it also meant that Thomas had to spend more time adjusting his camera settings between shots. At 5:30 p.m., they reached the final location, a quiet spot near the South Pond, partially hidden by weeping willows. Sarah suggested a series of intimate poses, positioning herself and James in a close embrace, their backs to the photographer. Thomas, excited by the artistic potential, agreed enthusiastically. As Thomas fiddled with his camera, Sarah leaned in close to James as if to kiss him. Instead, she whispered, "I know who you really are, Robert Caldwell." James froze, his body tensing against hers. Before he could respond, Sarah reached for the knife concealed beneath her skirt. In one swift motion, she pulled it out and plunged it into James' abdomen. James' eyes widened in shock and pain. He opened his mouth, perhaps to cry out, but Sarah quickly clamped her hand over it. She stabbed him again and again, her movements hidden from Thomas' view by their bodies and the fading light. James' knees buckled, and he began to collapse. Sarah, running on adrenaline and fury, managed to lower him to the ground in what looked like a romantic dip from Thomas' perspective. She positioned herself over James, using her body to shield his rapidly bleeding form from view. "Thomas!" Sarah called out, her voice shaking with what the photographer would later describe as excitement, but was actually a mix of fear and adrenaline. "I think we've got the perfect shot. Can you check the lighting once more?" As Thomas turned his attention back to his camera, Sarah leaned down close to James' ear. "This is for every woman you've ever lied to," she hissed. With one final thrust, she plunged the knife into his chest. James' body gave a final shudder, and then went still. Sarah felt the life leave him, a sensation that would haunt her for years to come. Realizing what she had done, Sarah's mind raced. She had to act fast. "Thomas!" she called out, injecting panic into her voice. "James has fainted. I think it's the heat. Can you run and get some water?" Thomas, concerned and flustered, immediately set down his camera and rushed off towards the park facilities. As soon as he was out of sight, Sarah sprang into action. She quickly wiped the knife on the inside of her skirt and tossed it into the pond. Then she dragged James's body closer to the water's edge, positioning him face down. With shaking hands, Sarah splashed water on her dress and mussed her hair. She smeared a bit of James's blood on her hands and face, creating a scene of desperate attempts to save him. By the time Thomas returned with water and a park security guard in tow, Sarah was kneeling beside James's body, sobbing hysterically. "He just collapsed," she cried. "I tried to pull him out of the water, but I couldn't." The security guard rushed to check James's vital signs while Thomas called for an ambulance. Sarah continued her performance, alternating between loud sobs and stunned silence. As sirens wailed in the distance, Sarah looked down at James's lifeless form. In that moment, the full weight of what she had done crashed down upon her. This was no longer about revenge or justice. She had taken a life, and there was no going back. The idyllic summer evening in Lincoln Park had become the scene of a brutal crime, one that would soon capture the attention of the entire city. As the first police cars pulled into the parking lot, Sarah steeled herself for what was to come. Her performance was far from over. As police sirens pierced the evening air, the peaceful atmosphere of Lincoln Park was shattered. The first officers on the scene quickly secured the area, pushing back the small crowd of curious onlookers that had begun to gather. Detective Michael Donovan, a veteran of the Chicago Police Department's homicide unit, arrived shortly after. Detective Donovan, known for his sharp mind and attention to detail, immediately took charge of the scene. His first action was to separate the witnesses. Sarah, still playing the role of the distraught fiancé, was gently led to a nearby bench, while Thomas, the photographer, was taken aside for questioning. The detective's experienced eye took in the scene. The victim, James Harrison, lay face down near the pond's edge, his body partially in the water. The summer suit he wore was soaked with a mixture of pond water and blood. Donovan noted the multiple stab wounds visible on the victim's back and sides. As the coroner examined the body, Donovan turned his attention to Sarah. She sat on the bench, her sundress stained with water and blood, her makeup streaked from apparent tears. To all appearances, she was the picture of a woman in shock. "Miss Thompson," Donovan began gently, "I know this is difficult, but I need you to tell me exactly what happened." Sarah's account was emotional but surprisingly detailed. She described arriving at the park for their engagement photo shoot, the various locations they had used, and how James had suddenly collapsed near the pond. She spoke of her desperate attempts to save him, how she had tried to pull him from the water. Donovan listened carefully, noting both what Sarah said and what she didn't say. Her story seemed consistent, but something about her demeanor nagged at him. Years of experience had taught him that things were often not as they appeared. Meanwhile, other officers were interviewing Thomas Green. The young photographer's account matched Sarah's in many respects, but with one crucial difference. Thomas described the couple's last pose, with Sarah leaning over James in what he thought was a romantic dip. He mentioned turning away to adjust his camera, then hearing Sarah's cry for help. As the interviews progressed, the forensics team combed the area for evidence. They photographed the scene, collected blood samples, and searched for the murder weapon. One officer, wading carefully through the shallow water of the pond, made a crucial discovery: a small, sharp knife, its blade stained with blood. Detective Donovan ordered an immediate dive team to search the pond thoroughly. He had a hunch that this seemingly romantic tragedy might be something far more sinister. Back at the precinct, the investigation kicked into high gear. Background checks were run on both Sarah and James. While Sarah's history came back clean, James revealed some intriguing discrepancies. His social security number didn't match his name, and there were gaps in his employment and residence history. Donovan's suspicions deepened when the forensics report came back. The blood on Sarah's dress matched the victim's, which was consistent with her story of trying to save him. However, trace evidence found under James' fingernails suggested a struggle, something Sarah had not mentioned. The autopsy report provided the final piece of the puzzle. The coroner determined that the fatal wounds had been inflicted from the front, not the back, as would be expected if James had simply collapsed. Moreover, the angle and force of the wounds indicated they were made by someone facing the victim, not by someone trying to help him. As the evidence mounted, Donovan began to see a different picture emerging. He ordered a search of Sarah's apartment, where officers discovered a hidden diary and a file of documents that blew the case wide open. The diary detailed Sarah's discovery of James's true identity and her feelings of betrayal and anger. The file contained evidence of James, or rather Robert Caldwell's, double life, including information about his wife and children in St. Louis. With this new information, Donovan re-interviewed Thomas Green. When pressed, Thomas remembered Sarah whispering something to James just before he collapsed. He couldn't hear what was said, but he recalled James' body tensing up. As the pieces fell into place, Detective Donovan realized he was dealing with a case of premeditated murder, not a tragic accident. The seemingly perfect bride-to-be had orchestrated a calculated act of revenge. 5 days after the incident in Lincoln Park, Detective Donovan felt he had enough evidence to make an arrest. He personally led the team to Sarah Thompson's apartment, ready to bring her in for formal questioning and likely charges. As they approached her door, Donovan couldn't help but feel a mix of professional satisfaction and personal regret. Another case solved, but at what cost? 2 lives destroyed, families shattered, all because of lies and betrayal. The detective knocked on the door, prepared to face the woman who had nearly pulled off the perfect crime. The next phase of this tragic story was about to begin. Detective Donovan's knock on Sarah Thompson's apartment door echoed in the quiet hallway. After a moment of tense silence, the door opened slowly. Sarah stood there, her appearance a far cry from the vibrant bride-to-be of just a week ago. Her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, her posture defeated. "Sarah Thompson," Donovan said formally, "you're under arrest for the murder of James Harrison, also known as Robert Caldwell. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As Donovan recited the Miranda rights, Sarah's shoulders slumped. She offered no resistance as she was handcuffed and led to the waiting police car. Her neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, whispering in shock at the sight of the once popular young woman being taken away in custody. At the police station, Sarah was fingerprinted and photographed. The mugshot captured a woman who looked both defiant and broken. During the initial questioning, she maintained her innocence, sticking to her story about James' collapse and her attempts to save him. However, when confronted with the evidence from her apartment, the diary and the file on Robert Caldwell, her composure cracked. "He lied to me," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "He lied to everyone. I couldn't let him keep doing it." With Sarah's confession, the case against her solidified. The district attorney's office moved quickly to file charges of first-degree murder. The news of the arrest and the sensational details of the case spread rapidly through Chicago, captivating the public's attention. The trial began 3 months later. In the fall of 1963, the Cook County Courthouse was packed each day with spectators and reporters, all eager to witness the unfolding drama. Sarah's defense attorney, a skilled litigator named Daniel Hoffman, opted for a strategy that combined a plea of temporary insanity with an appeal to the jury sympathy. Hoffman painted a picture of Sarah as a victim herself, a young woman betrayed and driven to the brink by the elaborate deceptions of Robert Caldwell. He brought in character witnesses who testified to Sarah's previously unblemished reputation and gentle nature. A psychologist was called to the stand, suggesting that Sarah had experienced a temporary break from reality due to the extreme emotional distress caused by her discovery of James' true identity. The prosecution, led by the ambitious Assistant District Attorney Megan Rivers, presented a markedly different narrative. Rivers portrayed Sarah as a cold, calculating killer who had methodically planned and executed her revenge. She emphasized the premeditation evident in Sarah's diary entries and her careful selection of the murder location. Key pieces of evidence were dramatically presented to the jury: the blood-stained knife retrieved from the pond, forensic reports detailing the nature and angle of James's wounds, and most damaging of all, Sarah's own words from her diary. The trial's most intense moment came when Sarah herself took the stand. Under Hoffman's gentle questioning, she recounted her relationship with James, her joy at their engagement, and the crushing revelation of his true identity. Her voice trembled as she described the moment in the park when she confronted him. "I just wanted him to admit it," Sarah testified, tears streaming down her face. "I wanted him to feel as hurt as I did, but when I saw his face, saw that he didn't even care, something in me just snapped." Rivers' cross-examination was brutal. She hammered at the inconsistencies in Sarah's story, forcing her to admit to each step of her planning. By the time Sarah left the stand, her composure was in tatters, and the sympathy of many jurors had visibly waned. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the case was about more than just Sarah Thompson. It had become a referendum on betrayal, on the limits of justifiable revenge, on the very nature of truth and lies in relationships. The media frenzy surrounding the trial reached fever pitch as the jury began their deliberations. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily, holding signs either condemning Sarah as a cold-blooded killer or supporting her as a victim of a cruel deception. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned to the packed courtroom. The foreman, a middle-aged schoolteacher, stood to deliver the verdict. The entire room held its breath, waiting to hear the fate of Sarah Thompson. "On the charge of murder in the first degree," the foreman began, his voice steady, We find the defendant, Sarah Thompson. The courtroom was silent, tense with anticipation. Sarah stood at the defense table, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. In this moment, hanging between judgment and fate, the full weight of her actions seemed to press down upon her. Whatever the verdict, she knew her life would never be the same. "Only guilty." The word echoed through the silent courtroom. For a moment it seemed as if time stood still. Then a collective gasp rippled through the spectators. Sarah Thompson swayed slightly, steadied by her attorney's hand on her arm. Her face, which had been a mask of tense anticipation, crumpled into an expression of despair. Judge Harold Winters called for order as murmurs swept through the courtroom. Once silence was restored, he addressed the jury, thanking them for their service before dismissing them. He then turned to Sarah. "Sarah Thompson, you have been found guilty of murder in the first degree. I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. As the judge's gavel fell, sealing her fate, Sarah finally broke down. Her sobs echoed in the suddenly hushed courtroom as she was led away by court officers. The verdict and sentencing made headlines across Chicago and beyond. Opinion was divided. Some saw justice served for a cold-blooded murder, while others felt sympathy for a woman they believed had been pushed to the brink by betrayal. In the days following the trial, more details emerged about Robert Caldwell's life. His wife in St. Louis, Margaret Caldwell, gave a tearful interview to a local news station. She spoke of her shock at learning of Robert's double life and her struggle to raise their children alone. The interview sparked a wave of sympathy for the Caldwell family, further complicating the public's perception of the case. Sarah Thompson began serving her sentence at the Dwight Correctional Center. The first years were hard. She struggled with depression and guilt, grappling with the consequences of her actions. However, as time passed, she began to engage in various prison programs, including counseling and education initiatives. 10 years into her sentence, Sarah wrote a book titled Betrayed and Broken: My Journey from Love to Murder. The memoir, which detailed her relationship with Robert James, the discovery of his lies, and her subsequent actions, became a bestseller. It reignited public interest in the case and sparked debates about the nature of betrayal and the limits of justifiable actions. 15 years after the trial, new evidence came to light. A private investigator hired by a true crime writer researching the case uncovered a pattern of similar deceptions by Robert Caldwell in other cities. This revelation led to a re-examination of Sarah's case. While it didn't exonerate her, it did contribute to a growing sentiment that her sentence had been overly harsh. In 2003, after serving 20 years of her sentence, Sarah Thompson was granted parole. At 64 years old, she emerged from prison into a world vastly different from the one she had left. Technology had advanced, societal norms had shifted, and Chicago itself had changed dramatically. Sarah's release was met with mixed reactions. Some protested, arguing that she hadn't served enough time for her crime. Others, including a support group that had formed around her case, welcomed her return to society. In the years following her release, Sarah dedicated herself to advocacy work, focusing on support for women who had experienced betrayal and domestic abuse. She gave talks at women's shelters and wrote articles about her experiences, cautioning against allowing pain and anger to lead to destructive actions. The case continued to fascinate the public. In 2010, a major Hollywood studio produced a film based on Sarah's story, reigniting interest in the events of that fateful summer day in 1963. As for the other lives touched by the tragedy, they too moved forward. Thomas Green, the young photographer who had witnessed the event, went on to have a successful career in photojournalism, though he rarely spoke about that day in Lincoln Park. Detective Donovan retired from the Chicago Police Department in 1985, with the Thompson case remaining one of the most memorable of his career. Margaret Caldwell and her children struggled for years with the aftermath of Robert's deceptions and violent end. The children, adults by the time of Sarah's release, had mixed feelings about the woman who had killed their father. The younger child, a daughter, eventually reached out to Sarah, seeking understanding and closure. In 2018, on the 55th anniversary of the murder, a documentary filmmaker brought together Sarah Thompson, now 79, and Margaret Caldwell, 83, for a conversation. The meeting, filmed for a documentary titled The Lies That Bind Us, was a poignant exploration of the long-lasting impacts of betrayal, the nature of forgiveness, and the unforeseen consequences of our actions. As the documentary aired, viewers across the country were reminded of the complex, tragic story that had unfolded in Chicago so many years ago. It served as a somber reminder of how a single act, born from pain and anger, can ripple through countless lives for decades to come. The case of Sarah Thompson and Robert Caldwell, once a sensational headline, had become a cautionary tale, a stark illustration of the destructive power of deceit and the heavy price of revenge. It continues to provoke discussion and debate, a tragic chapter in Chicago's history that refuses to be forgotten.